Brooks Running has a new shoe for you runners out there. Did you hear that? Better turn up your volume. In fact, turn it up to the max. Introducing the all-new Ghost Max. It's got all kinds of things to make your knees and ankles feel protected, like Max Cushion, Max Soft Landings with DNA Loft V2 foam, and Max Smooth Rides with their Glide Roll Rocker. Feel better on your run with Ghost Max. Learn more at brooksrunning.com.
This podcast is brought to you by drunkmummysobermummy.com and made in association with HelloSundayMorning.org, changing the world's relationship with alcohol, one Sunday at a time.
Oh, the kettle's boiled.
Great. Perfect timing.
Should we get started then?
I'm Victoria Vanstone.
I'm Lucy Good.
And this is Sober Awkward. Right, Lucy, over to you.
Thanks, Vic. So whatever stage you're at on your sober journey, and Vic and I are at completely different stages, you'll know that life without booze can at times feel, what do you reckon?
Awkward. Lucy and I invite you to listen to our podcast where we discuss the realities of sobriety, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the cringingly embarrassing. Our honest and open chats will help you discover what it really means to be sober.
Yes, we're here like a dodgy bottle of port from your nan's drink cabinet to take the edge off sobriety. And together we can learn how to feel the awkward and do it anyway. I can see you and I can hear you. Can you see me and hear me?
I can. I've got the giggles now because we are like two old grannies trying to get on a Skype call.
We started at 9 o'clock and it's now 9:53 and we've only just managed to get it working.
Oh, these COVID times, Lucy, it causes all sorts of problems, doesn't it?
Yeah, so this is really different to our usual podcast setup. So apologies to everybody who notices all the massive errors we're making here, there and everywhere. But I unfortunately have got COVID, which I caught off of my pesky teenagers who all work in the hospitality industry, and we live in a tourist town, so I didn't really stand a hope in hell thinking about it. But what it means is that Vic and I haven't been able to get together for our final podcast of the series, which has been pretty disappointing for us because we like catching up with one another. But it's meant that we've had to really think outside the box, haven't we, Vic, to pull this one together?
Yeah, we're attempting technology without Alan, which is like a bloody nightmare because he's like a genius, isn't he?
It's okay.
He's like a robot.
He is. And it's fine because I don't mind wasting my entire Friday morning while you and I connect, disconnect, disappear, start to send, like, Vic she was like, ready, go. And I went to introduce a podcast and she just disappeared.
It's like I've gone down into quicksand. I've suddenly just melted away.
So, Vic, do you want to explain what we're doing? Because we're going around this differently, aren't we, this time?
Yeah, so we're recording this on Squadcast today because Lucy's in isolation and I'm away for school holidays. So we're just kind of, I'm draped in sort of birthday things hanging from the ceilings because it was my son's 10th birthday yesterday. So yeah, we're doing this in weird circumstances. Yeah. And I'm just happy that I can see Lucy and she's looking well. How are you feeling, Lucy?
Yeah, I feel fine, actually. I tested positive a week ago now, and not to go into symptoms or anything, but I've been one of the lucky ones. I did have some coldy symptoms, and a really zapped of energy was my main thing, and I still feel that a bit now, but all up, I've been fine, and my teenagers have all managed to cope wonderfully and seem to just have a couple of days of symptoms and were back and feeling fine again. So I think we've been really lucky. And in some respects, I'm quite glad that we've got it out the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's running rampant here, isn't it, Lucy? I mean, it's just our situation in Australia has gone from us not really feeling any sort of COVID nearby to us feeling like it's kind of sitting on our doorstep. So it does cause a little bit of anxiety because we haven't really experienced that over here. There is some sort of thing called COVID anxiety. I keep seeing people, I was laughing today, Lucy, because I went to the supermarket and I see people with their masks just below their nose, like sitting below their nose. I think, oh, what's the point in that? It's like putting a condom on your bollocks, isn't it?
Well, it is. Oh, God, I've seen that. Is so funny. And my daughter was doing that the other day, and I just went up to her and grabbed her mask and put it over her nose. I said, if nothing else, it makes you look so stupid if you don't wear it over your nose. More than anything.
You got it on wrong. Yeah. You may as well wear it over your ass.
Yeah, that's right. God, that might be quite handy for me with my mild incontinence of the latter years of motherhood.
Oh, God. Too much information.
Sorry about that.
But I totally understand.
A mask on your arse. Now, there's a thing.
Might invent those, yeah.
Now,
arse mask.
Yeah, great new business idea there, Vic, for us. But we've actually got a guest on, which has been made it even more slightly challenging. This is one of our podcasts where we wanted a guest on today. So just so that our listeners know what's going to happen, we're just going to have a bit of a chat about our topic. And then what was meant to happen was Vic and I were meant to be talking to our wonderful guests this week, but I couldn't. So Vic actually did that on her own. So this podcast is going to run with us having a bit of a chat about the topic. Then I'm actually taking a step back because it's Vic and our guest talking together afterwards. So you've been really good, Vic, rushing around and doing all of that. So thank you for taking the load off me while I've been lying in front of Netflix getting over COVID. And you've also had your son's birthday as well up there. So how did that go?
Yeah, it was good. I was going to put you your little COVID bout to shame by complaining about how the fact I've been out for poached eggs on toast twice this week and the bread's been soggy.
Oh, well, you see, COVID's got nothing on that. I can imagine how inconvenient that was for you.
It was extremely inconvenient, Lucy. I just cannot. Why have a cafe and
oh,
serve...
Here we go.
For fuck's sake. Why have a fucking cafe and serve soggy bread with poached eggs that taste of vinegar?
Oh, they didn't drain the eggs. They didn't drain the eggs, did they?
Twice, 2 days in a row, I was crying on my pillow at night. So, yeah, your COVID is nothing in comparison to that.
I agree. Nothing worse than a soggy bit of toast, especially when you paid for it.
I know. Anyway, we have been out for a nice breakfast because it was my son George's 10th birthday and we went blueberry picking and we had a lovely time. And it reminded me, actually, that it's 10 years since I really started questioning my drinking. It was after his birth when I was trying to combine motherhood and booze, which was where my worlds collided a little bit. Yes. And having that baby was, really where my shame started. Before, I didn't need to feel any shame because I could just, run away to another town or drink it away or do whatever I needed to do. But once the baby was born, of course, I had a consequence to shame. And George really represents that to me. It was a beautiful birthday, but there was part of me inside that was able to sort of reminisce about that shame. And that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah, we are. We're talking about shame. It's actually brought something to mind, Vic, that I hadn't thought of before when we were preparing the podcast. But my daughter went out for a drink with her dad last week, and he proceeded to tell her that on her 4th birthday, her dad and I and a couple of other people got absolutely off our rockers. And she came back and said to me, oh, Dad told me that on my 4th birthday, you and Dad did this, that and the other. And I thought, oh, that's shameful. And I thought, oh, we probably did get off of our heads, but it would have been after she went to bed that we did that. Still not good. But I actually went to the point of bringing up the pictures of her 4th birthday party where we actually hired out some activity, a clown, I think, with a friend of hers. They had a joint party at a local hall. So I showed her...
You didn't sleep with the clown, did you?
Well, I don't know. I don't remember. So I showed her all the pictures of her having a wonderful time and me and her dad in the pictures and looking completely sober. And I said, look, this was your 4th birthday. And I said, your dad has probably got a point. We probably did get off our heads, but it was after we'd done your birthday party. And it was interesting because I actually felt this need to, it took me ages to find the bloody online photos. You know how hard it is to find photos online going back sort of 14 years. But I really felt shame when she said that, and he was telling her, because he was telling her and her boyfriend because he still found it funny. And in fact, it upset her. So I went to a lot of effort to show her that, she did have an amazing 4th birthday party, and she had all the things a 4-year-old should have at their birthday party. But I was also honest and said, yes, probably later on in the evening, me and your dad did kind of get off of our heads. A bit like the Christmas thing. You spend so long organising it that you feel you deserve to get absolutely caned afterwards. But yes, I was so ashamed. I felt so ashamed of what he'd said to her that I needed to prove that wasn't necessarily the case.
And part of this podcast is about that today. Like, it's about accepting that shame and saying, yeah, I did do that. That was my past life. But hey, look at me now. Yes. And that's why we can talk about shame, and that's why we want to, is because, once you let it go and talk about it, you are capable of moving on from it, I think.
Yeah.
Actually, this is the last episode of series 2, and we wanted to end the series with not so many laughs. There'll be a few, don't you worry, but we don't want to have a lot of piss taking, but I'm not sure I can hold back too much, Lucy. Yeah, but we want to talk about a topic that highlights problem drinking, and a guest we wanted to have on that has experienced firsthand the actual damage that alcohol does. Later on in the show, as Lucy said, we're going to have a heart-wrenching chat with Sarah Drage. Sarah lost her dad to alcohol use disorder, and her story represents that of many. I mean, those statistics that me and Lucy so often talk about, we say, they're numbers, but actually they're people. Sarah's dad and many others like him have sadly passed away because of the shame attached to their mental health and to addiction. So today you're going to get insight from someone that's been there, a look into what can happen if your drinking habit goes unchecked and spirals out of control. So yeah, that shame really ate me up, Lucy, in those Sunday mornings. It sunk into every pore in my body. It was shame that kept me drinking, and the stigma attached to the word alcoholic that stopped me getting the help I well and truly deserved. I think when I think about it now, Lucy, I think, well, many people think of alcoholism. They usually jump straight to the more extreme cases of the disorder, like homeless people hooked up to machines in hospital, people getting the sack or losing their job or not being able to take care of your children, like you're talking about at that party. People that black out a lot and get the shakes if they stop. I think we tick a few of those boxes, actually. Like, I mean, we're talking about extreme, but I've fitted into the extreme on some occasions.
Yeah, you're sort of saying those things, and I'm thinking, that's me. So yeah, we certainly do tick some of those boxes, and that's quite a frightening thing. But I guess what we forget is that some people are suffering behind closed doors, and they're the ones like me, and who couldn't face the world and couldn't admit to having a problem because of the stigma attached. I mean, I was a single mum of 2 kids, so how on earth was I supposed to admit to it and not feel all of this shame?
Yeah, not feel judged. I mean, I know we all judge people that admit to having an alcohol problem, but we're judging as we're ordering, another pint at the bar. It's really sort of hypocritical almost, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. We drench ourselves until we're drowning in the stuff, yet we don't feel worthy of help because we don't want to be judged. It's like a never-ending circle. It's really awful. So instead of fessing up to the issue, drinkers have, I guess, no choice but to carry on, which means millions of people all over the world suffer in silence and keep on drinking until they end up in the direst circumstances imaginable.
Yeah, the reason why Lucy and I are keen to have Sarah on is not only because we think she's an utter inspiration for talking about this, and we feel her story could have been the story of our own children. Personally, I kept drinking because of the shame and stigma surrounding my habit. It was just too awful to bear, so I carried on. And I know Lucy feels the same. We could have ended up drinking our lives away and missing out on our kids growing up. That is the reality of alcohol.
Well, I kind of did miss out on part of my kids growing up through drinking, but I saved it at the last hurdle.
You are much naughtier than me.
I'm way naughtier, aren't I? I don't mind being naughtier. I just don't want to be more of an alkie than you.
Yeah, fair enough.
Look, we both believe that if we had not reached out and sought help in some way, our own children might have had to go through just what Sarah has been through, and that is the pain of losing someone they love to alcohol. So why do shame and alcohol seem to stick together? I guess it can depend on so many factors. There's past trauma that can trigger shame. There's mental health issues, generational addiction issues, low self-worth. You can feel shame about practically anything. Scientifically, we feel shame after alcohol because alcohol is a depressant and it affects the brain's level of happiness.
Yeah, for example, a night out, you went drinking, you feel a sense of happiness when you're out. However, the next day you'll be deficient in these same chemicals. And this can lead to you feeling down or depressed. Thus, the vicious cycle of drinking begins. The drinking creates the shame, and then you drink to drown out the shame. It's hard to get off that train once it's out of the station. Before we chat to Sarah, let's tell the listeners about our history of shame, Lucy. What does shame mean to you?
Oh, talking about shame, Vic, how long have you got?
Yeah, I know. It's a bit of a heavy one.
Brimming with shame. Having been sober for a year and 3 months, shame does still hit me like someone punching me in the stomach when I think of some of the things that I did. It is just such a powerful emotion. Shame is, and it's horrible. I think we avoid shame in every area of our lives that we possibly can, certainly as we grow older and learn how to do that. But the fact that you can have a few drinks and then go off and do something completely out of character, which is so desperately shameful, is such a scary thing that we will ever put ourselves in that position. So the shame that I felt as a drinker, I think will stay with me forever. I don't mind that so much because it's one of those things that will make me never, ever take a drink again because of shame of the way that I behaved with it. I guess really through my drinking days and certainly my latter ones, it was a shame that made me drink more. Because I was just so desperately embarrassed about that person that I was and the things that I did. And the only way to get rid of that feeling was to drink and to numb it. Some of the things I did were quite horrific, quite embarrassing. And I'm just horrified by it even to this day.
I guess that kind of causes trauma, which again causes shame. It's like this, it's such this vicious circle, isn't it? You just even describing it there. It's like, it's never ending because if you drink, there's no doubt that you're going to cause shame. And also, it's a good point there. Like we drank so much that we went into a blackout. So we don't even know really if the shame existed because we don't know what we've done. So therefore we feel shame over the things that are forgotten. It's like an unknown shame because I used to wake up and think, God, where have I been? Who have I been with? Have no recollection of 5 hours of the night. And that brought on massive amount of shame, which is really strange because I might have acted well, very unlikely.
Very unlikely, Vic. Well, yeah, that's it, isn't it? We were so used to performing shameful activities and behaving in a shameful way that if we had a blackout, which you and I were both having a lot by the end of our drinking days, we just assume that we've done something shameful in that time. So it doesn't really matter if you have or you haven't. You're just so full of it. You're drenched in shame, and it's just horrible. Another reason that I felt shame, Vic, was that feeling that, well, alcohol is so readily available. There are so many people out there who seem to be able to drink it in moderation. Why haven't I been able to do that? I felt weak in the face of alcohol because I had this problem and other people didn't. And I felt shame in that. I felt shame that I wasn't able to handle something that was so readily accepted into our society. And that shame grew and grew, certainly as I drank more and my blackouts became longer and my behaviour got worse. But it certainly grew as I aged. I think I've mentioned before on the podcast, being a middle-aged woman drinking, it's just not cool. You can get away with it in your 20s. I'm not saying you should drink a great deal in your 20s, but you can get away with being crazy drunk on a night out. But in your 40s, it just doesn't look good. It's a shameful look. It's a shameful memory in the morning. And even more so as a mum, being a drunk mum is a terrible way to be. And it was that shame and that horror of where I'd got to that kept me drinking. And ultimately, it was the shame at who I'd become, because drinking is who I was. That made me get worse and made me turn into a behind closed door drinker because I was too afraid to admit to anybody that I'd got to this state where I was bringing up 2 girls. I couldn't stop drinking. I couldn't do it without drinking. So, that shame just ran through all of my drinking years, it was a big part of me continuing to drink, being unable to reach out for help with drink. And it stays with me now. And I can feel, even talking about it now, that feeling in my stomach, that pit of anxiety building up as I think of shame. So I'm going to use that now, though, to stop me, to make sure I never go back to drinking.
I think those reminders, I know you always say if you see someone hungover, it makes you sort of feel sick. And that, for me, if I see someone that's drinking or hungover, all I remember is the shame. I think, I just never want to feel like that. It was so overwhelming lying in bed on a Sunday morning with that, waves of shame crashing over my soul each day. It was terrible. And that's what drinking reminds me of. It reminds me of shame. It takes me straight back there. I mean, I felt shame after every single drinking session, especially if I'd done something really weird. I mean, I remember after my hen night, which, I got stuck wedged down the side of a sofa and had to call out for someone to come and help me. And I remember waking up the next day. My mate was like, "Are you all right?" I was like, I'm wedged.
Well, you literally couldn't get out.
No, I was like a fish flapping around between the cupboard and the floor. And I was really hungover and I was just lying there feeling shame, not being able to move, but knew I had to call out for help because I couldn't get myself out.
Oh, gosh.
I mean, I know. And just so many things. I woke up once wearing a tiny bow tie like an evil ventriloquist dummy, and it was really tight around my neck. But I had no idea where I'd got it from. Oh. I looked in the mirror and I had this tiny little bow tie really tightly around my neck. It was really weird. I mean, I've woken up in a pile of vomit wearing a sombrero. I've done all of this crazy shit. But it seems funny now. And I know, Lucy, we turn our stories into, like a lot of our shame stories, like, what makes this podcast sort of amusing. But after those events, I always felt a terrible, terrible amount of shame. And that was what turned into anxiety, especially after the birth of my first child 10 years ago. But what I must say here, Lucy, is it was shame that led me to seek help. So that's really important that we talk about it and say how we're feeling about our shame. And I had to walk out into the lounge that day when my anxiety had got so bad that I felt like I was going to die or going to go mental or be knocking on the door of an asylum to take me in. It was shame that pushed me there, and to walk into my husband and say, I need help. So that's the interesting part. We can face shame and we can turn it around. And if you face the shame, perhaps that is the beginning of the path to sobriety. And also, after I had therapy, I had to understand that there was no point in me feeling shame anymore, because that behaviour that I was undertaking when I was under the influence wasn't me. It was a person who had taken a drug and was, had alcohol pumping around my veins, which made me do crazy stuff. It doesn't represent me as a human now. I am not that person sober. So I don't feel shame now about those things. I'm happy to tell my stories and happy to tell people what it was like, which is why we started this podcast in the first place. I had to let that shit go. I do get the occasional reminder, which reminds me of drinking can cause a craving, but it's very, very futile. Like, those moments are very, very short-lived, and I don't really go into them mentally. So I think shame can lead you to getting help.
Yeah. Oh, I think it can. It's interesting what we've both said there, Vic, which is that I hold on sometimes to my shame. And because I'm a year and 3 months sober, which might sound like a really long time to some, but it's still not all that long to me, considering I drank for 25 years. But, so I like to hold on to that shame as a weapon to protect me from drinking again. And you're saying that your shame, you turned it around and you used it as your tool to get support. And it's interesting how we've both changed what shame is. And I guess we relabeled it in this podcast, the way that we talk about it and we laugh about it. And I think that was one of the things that really helped me to give up drinking when I first met Vic, was it was just sitting and laughing at the ridiculous things we'd done when we were drunk. I mean, we can't stop them having happened. They did happen. So what are we going to do? Are we just going to sort of block them off from our lives? That is not mentally healthy. The things that happened in our life happened. So let's just have a laugh at those crazy things that we did, which are so desperately shameful. And we will admit that they are shameful. However, we are not going to be doing that. Like Vic said, we're different people now. We're not going to be doing those things anymore. We're a safe distance from them, aren't we?
Yeah.
We're far enough away from them to sort of go over them, have a laugh about them and say, God, I'm glad I'm not that person anymore.
Yeah, exactly. It was interesting this week. I didn't mean to do a post for this podcast, but I did a post on my group and said, like, come on, ladies, it's ready to let that shit go and let's talk about our shame stories. And I thought it would just be a couple of people going, yeah, I did this, I did that, I feel shame. But it was actually this massive post of 50 comments with everybody telling all of their shame stories. So a big shout out to all those women that shared their shame stories. And the post ended up being so liberating because we all managed to get these stories off our chest with no judgment, because we're all the same. We've all done this stuff. We're not hiding the fact that we've all done crazy stuff and, weeing in spots and doing, all this crazy stuff. So I just wanted to add a little bit to this podcast this morning called The Shame Shed. 2 of the ladies I emailed directly and said, look, your story really made me cry with laughter. Can I share it? So the Shame Shed entrants today are 2 ladies from the Facebook group who have agreed to share their stories. The first one of them shared a quote from Jay-Z that said, you can't heal if you don't reveal, which I thought was just perfect for this podcast. Like, you can't get over shame unless you talk about it. So one of the ladies on the group, she got a tattoo after a day of bottomless champagne, she says in exclamation marks. In what's those? Not exclamation marks.
Speech
those
marks.
Other ones. Speech marks. Yes. I mean bottomless champagne day. That's a recipe for disaster. Right there, isn't it?
Dangerous. Red flags are flying.
Yes. She got the coordinates of 3 places she loves most in the world on her arse. As she Googled the coordinates, they seemed very, very long, so she rounded them up. Now she has something like Gatwick Airport, Parramatta, and the middle of the ocean on her bum forever.
There's your memory right there. There's your shameful memory.
Oh, there were so many. It's worth a read. And another lady, this was my favourite. One Halloween, she was blacked out and dressed as a Christmas elf, and she couldn't stand up. She refused to let people help her and would hit anyone who tried to with a giant yard candy cane. So she was like half passed out in like a bush, and anyone that came to try and help her, she was attacking them. This elf was attacking them from the... She said she felt definitely... She said, it's not one of my proudest moments, but, you've got to get these things off your chest. We've all been there. It's fine. There was another woman that got banned from a theme park for a year.
Did she say why?
Yeah, she'd got thrown out by the bouncers from one part of it already for being drunk, and then she got thrown out by some other bouncers, and they just ended up banning her and throwing her out. There were so many stories on there. But actually, everybody was so supportive of them. Like, some of them were funny, some of them were sad, some of them were real shame stories that they felt really humiliated by. But as Jay-Z says, if you can't heal, you can't heal if you don't reveal, which I think is a brilliant saying.
Yeah, it really is. And for me, as I always talk, Vic, about how meeting you really changed me in terms of my drinking habits, and in fact got me sober. And it was having somebody to share those crazy stories with. And we're not sort of making light of them. I mean, they're not really, they are funny, but they're not funny. But being able to talk to somebody about them and to let them out and to just share, rather than bottle them all up inside you and letting that shame grow and grow and grow and get in the way of your healthy path to sobriety. Get them out, talk to other people, know that you're not alone. Sometimes just knowing that other people have got these horrendously shameful stories as well. And just always remembering that is not who you are anymore. It is something that you did, though, and you can't cut off part of what you did. You've got to own it. And
my crazy stories are part of me. That is my life prior to this. I've done drinking, I've done the crazy stories. I couldn't say I hadn't lived. I have lived my life to the max, and it's been ups and downs and risky in places, but I have lived, and it was chaotic, but now I want some peace, and that's what sobriety brings, is peace.
Yeah, it does. It does. And owning everything. You have to own it all. Warts and all, many warts on our journey. But look, it's true, Vic, and we do laugh on these podcasts, and it's our way really of getting a serious message out to the world. We hope that our openness and our humour educates others around the dangers of alcohol, really, don't we?
Yeah, and as we say at the end of some of our podcasts, we never want to make light of the issue, and we take the misuse and the normalisation of alcohol in society really seriously, Lucy and I. You know, we're just getting a message across in another way so that we can help people change their attitudes and make seeking help for any form of overdrinking more accessible.
And that's why we're ending this series with Vic's chat with Sarah, which is brilliant, by the way. I've already heard it, and have the tissues ready, listeners. We want you to be able to hear that, you know, how this can end if your drinking carries on. And that's what Sarah's story is. So pause this now, take a breath, make a cup of tea, grab the tissues if you're feeling a little bit emotional, and listen as Sarah tells us all about her dad.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. And I hope you feel better. We'll hand this over to me and Sarah now.
Yeah, thank you, Vic.
I'm lucky enough to have Sarah Drage with me, zooming in all the way from England onto the Sober Awkward podcast today. Unfortunately, as we know, Lucy has COVID, so I'm all alone in the booth. Unfortunately, Sarah's had to meet Alan, which probably was a bit traumatic for her. But she can confirm, I think, Sarah, can't you, that Alan is real and he does exist?
He is. Yeah, I can see him. He's real. I can hear him.
Yeah. I think all of our listeners would probably be a bit jealous that you got to see Alan, because he's a bit of an enigma, that guy. Anyway, I'm just going to tell our listeners a little bit about you, Sarah. So just bear with me one sec. Sarah is a TEDx speaker and founder of the charitable organisation Warrior Kind, based in Kent in England. She is a devoted daughter on a mission to quash the stigmas attached to mental illness and alcohol addiction. After losing her dad in 2017 to alcohol use disorder, Sarah leveraged her own lived experiences of bereavement, anxiety, OCD and PTSD, and channeled her trauma into founding the mental health support organisation Warrior Kind, where encouraging healthy conversations around mental well-being is core to their mission in breaking down stigmas and supporting her community. Sarah has found the strength, resilience and passion within to triumph over adversity and raise awareness around the dangers of societal stigmas attached to mental illness and addictions, ensuring that her beloved dad is not just another statistic, and that his death can become a catalyst for positive change. Sarah's story resonates so much with Lucy and I. We feel that if our drinking had carried on, our children might have to go through exactly what Sarah has. If we hadn't reached out for the support of others, we feel that our drinking habits would have gone unchecked and spiralled out of control behind closed doors. I first heard Sarah on the Sober Dave podcast, and I remember having to pull over the car and grab a tissue. Her story highlights the danger of alcohol and how, as a society, we need to look at how we normalise drinking culture and the damage it does to not only individuals, but also communities. I am so lucky to have this brave and inspiring lady with me today on the Sober Awkward podcast. Welcome, Sarah. How are you?
Hi, I'm really good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great, thanks. We were just, before we started recording, we were just comparing the weather, which obviously in Australia and England is the done thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm boiling hot and you're freezing cold. Is that about right?
It really is. It's really cold here.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us so much. And as I said before, Lucy and I feel like your story is so important, because we feel like if our drinking had continued, if we hadn't put aside the shame and stigma that surrounded our drinking habits, that we would be in the same situation as your poor dad got into. So tell me about life growing up with your dad, Sarah. What was it like?
Oh, do you know what? Our childhood with my dad was amazing. I was his eldest daughter out of 3 girls, and I was pretty much glued to my dad's hip. So he'd take me everywhere with him. He was a builder by trade. He used to renovate a lot of property, and I can remember him taking me to the building merchants and sitting me on tops of bags of cement and pushing me around, just pushing me on a big trolley and holding my hand and taking me to business meetings. Wherever he was going, I was with him. I think he was he was a very devoted dad, he doted on his children, absolutely loved us, adored us, told us every day. So he was very, very sensitive, very in touch with his feelings that way. And he was my hero. I really looked up to him, and I noticed a significant change when I became a teenager. So it was probably between the ages of 12 and 13. I noticed my dad had become a lot more withdrawn, a lot more, he was snappier. He didn't really want to get involved. That whole relationship of father and daughter kind of was becoming a little bit more distant.
Had something happened in particular there, Sarah, to make him change?
Yes, he'd gone through something incredibly traumatic, which that's a story for another day.
Yes.
But it was a matter of life and death for him. And
right.
It really, I mean, looking back, he definitely had some kind of PTSD, anxiety, depression. But it went undiagnosed. It was so obvious now. Now I look back on it, it was so obvious what he was going through. And he was using alcohol to mask that. So he got sucked into one stigma of men shouldn't discuss their mental health. And my dad was a Yorkshire man, so he was very, very proud. So talking about his mental health or anxiety or depression was just unheard of. He wouldn't have done it. So yeah, he was definitely drinking to mask that. And to be honest, he said to me, I drink to forget. If that wasn't an indication, then I don't know what was. So yeah, he was drinking to forget, as he said. So when I became a teenager, I definitely noticed there was a change, there was a difference in him. And that was when our relationship, I wouldn't say so much fractured, but I definitely began to resent him. So his behaviour would consist of different moods. We never knew what to expect. And I always remember saying to him, whenever we'd go anywhere, don't embarrass me today, Dad, just act normal. I mean, whatever normal is. But it was things like his tone of voice would change, or he might have become aggressive in his tone. So he'd reminisce and become bitter over his past, and he'd start talking about it. Or he would completely withdraw himself. So sometimes he'd go and sit in the car at an event and just be really unsociable. And I never knew what that meant. I never pieced two and two together or realised that it was a drink problem. I knew my dad was behaving differently, and we all knew he was behaving differently. The atmosphere, the laying on the sofa with his eyes closed in a dark room, all of that, reclining the seat in the car and just laying it was just little things like that was just unnormal behaviour. And I always used to say, I just wish you could be a normal dad, even down to my mum was always the one driving, and I never used to understand that. I always used to say, why aren't you driving, Dad? Why can't you pick us up from school? Why is it always mum? And it was because he was drinking. It was because when I was a teenager, his addiction was probably really, really starting to manifest and take a hold. But it really peaked when I was about 19, 20. And I decided at that point that I love you, but I can't live with you anymore. So it was a tough decision, because I knew that I needed to get out of the family home, but I didn't want to, but I felt like I had to. So I moved out and I went to university, because I knew at that point I didn't have that luxury of having my parents be able to support me financially. So I was doing that myself. So I became very independent, and my dad really did instill that in us anyway, but I became independent in other ways. So I was never really dependent on my parents. So I moved out, went to university, and I met my husband while I was at university, and I fell pregnant in my final year. That is when we realised that my dad had a drink problem, and we kind of admitted it to ourselves. But again, we were still quite in denial, and we didn't talk about it to anybody. So
by this point, Sarah, how long was it since that your relationship had sort of disintegrated and become so sort of awkward, I guess? How long had he been struggling with coming to terms with his addiction?
Years.
Years,
Honestly,
yeah.
I would have said it was years, but it was a subconscious thing, if that makes
Mm,
sense.
yeah.
It was something that we, there was so much resentment there and bitterness towards him for what he'd put us through. Um,
Mm.
but we never really admitted it to ourselves, let alone him admitting it. We struggled to admit it. So I would say everybody talks about the alcoholic being in denial, but we were also in denial. And not just that, we were protecting him. I didn't want
Yeah.
to go and say anything to anybody. I didn't want to tell my teachers. I didn't want to tell my lecturers that, oh, my dad's an alcoholic and I'm struggling at home and it's affecting me. We just kind of got on with it and just lived with it. It was just there.
I think the reality of it is sometimes too much to bear, so it just kind of shove it under the carpet, and that's exactly the issue, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we did. We brushed it under the carpet, and we brushed it under the carpet to protect ourselves, but to also protect him. Because, I mean, at that point, we were living on a housing estate when my mum was working all hours under the sun, and my dad was passed out most times on the sofa, dealing with his mental illness, but his addiction as well. And we were having to fend for ourselves and kind of just get on with it. And you didn't really then at that point, I didn't want to tell people what my dad was going through, because already there's a stereotype that I was being brought into of, or you come from a housing estate and you're pregnant and you're still at university. There was so many societal stigmas that I was already dealing with, that to then come out and say my dad's an alcoholic and I need help, he needs help, I kind of felt I felt embarrassed. I'm not going to lie. I'm ashamed to say that now, but I felt embarrassed. I felt ashamed, and I know he did as well. I think we all did.
And I guess that feeling of resentment that you had towards him because you didn't understand addiction at the time, you didn't understand his illness, because you were too young to understand, I guess. You know, it takes a while to comprehend what's going on with someone that's in that situation. And for me as well, like it's taken me 40 years to understand what's going on with people. It's very difficult to comprehend what's happening. And the easiest thing to do is just to ignore it and get on with your own life, which I guess is what you did.
I did. I kind of escaped it. I moved away, escaped it, but I was a lot older before my time. I had, despite my resentment and my bitterness towards him, I was always trying to fix him. And apparently that is a manifestation of a child of an alcoholic. I fell into a category of, I wanted to protect him from that stigma, and I also wanted to fix him. So I was always trying. My feeling in my head was, if I go to university and I do well, then people won't think that my dad failed as a parent because I've done so well, and then I will be able to help him because I'll have the resources financially to put him through rehab. So I was always, every choice that I was making was centered around my dad's addiction. And I didn't realize at the time that I had anxiety myself. It was just something that became so ingrained in me that I just learned to live with it. So it was little things that and I still get like it now, but I'd become anxious around people's moods. So whatever mood somebody was in, I was on edge, or I was, I could pick up, I was so sensitive to people's moods, and it made me on edge. It made me anxious. It made me nervous. I couldn't stand being around anybody in a bad mood. And I think that is a manifestation of not knowing what mood my dad was in. And
it's interesting what you're saying, Sarah, because like what you're telling me, you had all these resentments and everything was going on. But yet the love was still so pure for your dad, no matter what, no matter how things had turned out and what was going on with him. Every decision you made was to try and get him out of this situation. And it's incredible, isn't it, but in a family, how no matter what happens, the love is still so strong. And that's just lovely to hear.
It was unconditional, and I can genuinely say that I knew. You see, I said at the beginning, where I was with my dad, he took me everywhere, we did everything together. I knew I'd experienced that part of my dad, so I knew what he was capable of, and I knew that this wasn't him.
Yeah.
I knew it wasn't him, but I just, again, I was 21 at that point, and I was, yeah, it was tough. It was tough. It was a whirlwind. It was, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was times when my dad had sober moments. So there were moments of sobriety where we could have a proper conversation with him. And he was always the person that I'd pick up the phone to and ask life advice for. Because he was so good at giving it. He wasn't judgmental. He was so laid back with us. He was always there, and he always told us he loved us. Like, that was one thing that he knew. He had his ways, and despite it all, he always used to say to us, "I love you. I'll just want what's best for you, and I'm sorry I can't do that for you." So he was never violent. Yes, he could get in bad moods and come across in his tone quite aggressively, and that was definitely the drink talking. But when it was my dad, he was such a loving, doting family man. And it broke my heart that other people didn't get to see that like we saw it, his close family. So yeah, the love was very much there. It was very much unconditional. And it still is. And even when the addiction peaked, I would say I was 25. It really peaked at that point. I'd had my little girl at 22. So I was so young, really, really young. And then I fell pregnant again with my youngest. But during that pregnancy, I developed health anxiety. And after a lot of therapy, we've pinpointed that the health anxiety was a manifestation of my dad's drinking habits. So I couldn't control my dad's drinking. And I remember doing it. I remember getting to a point where I've got my own little family to worry about. And then I've got my dad to worry about. And it was getting so much that I compartmentalized in my brain and I allocated certain times to worry about my dad. So I made a pact with myself and I said, well, I'm only going to worry about my dad when I'm on the phone to him or when I see him. And then when I'm not around my dad or I'm not talking to my dad, I can then focus my worry on my family. So I'll only think about it at those times. So I did that. But what happened was I developed health anxiety on my own health because suddenly I'm a mum, I'm a parent, and I think to myself, how can my dad put me through this? Like, if anything happened, like it to me, I wouldn't want my children going through that. I don't want my children to lose their parents. So I became so consumed and so worried about my own health because I couldn't control my dad's health. And I was so worried about leaving my kids without a parent and I wanted to break that cycle. And I wanted my children to have a better family environment than what I did. And I became obsessed with it. I didn't realize at the time that was why I was like that. It was manifesting because it was a control thing. I couldn't control my dad's health, but I could control my own health. So I was focusing on that. And it was it was tough.
It's understandable that you had that reaction, though, isn't it? Because you're trying to manage so many things. You're trying to balance so many plates at the same time. I mean, I know how you feel. I've got my son at the moment is rather unwell, and I'm trying to do so many things, in my life, and I have to compartmentalize, like you say. I have to think about that 1 minute because if I think about all the time that one topic all the time, which is epilepsy, it is going to consume me mentally and I will go down with that ship. But you know what I mean? I can't. So I totally understand where you're coming from. It sounds like there was a lot going on for you. What actually happened then with your dad? How did this all peak and how did it end?
So we were due to go on a family holiday. My mum and dad had separated at this point. The drinking had become too much for my mum. She still really cared about him, still really loved him. But I think that relationship all her daughters had grown up, moved out, and it was time for her to go as well. So that happened. And I would have said at that point, my dad's addiction peaked. That was another trauma in his life. At that point, he felt like he'd lost everything. And he turned up to a family holiday without my mum. So it was meant to be my sisters and my husband and me and the girls and my dad. He was so drunk and he was saying things and he was slurring his words. And I looked at him and I said, Dad, you can't come on this holiday with us. I'm going to take you home. You're going to have to sleep this off. I don't want you being around the kids like this. You're going to ruin the whole holiday. You're going to ruin the atmosphere. It's not fair. It's not fair on us. and it's going to take you 5 days to recover from this binge. So I took him home, and he was telling me symptoms he was having, like he was coughing up blood. He was shaking. If he weren't drinking, he was shaking. He was in a lot of pain if he didn't have a drink. And he was trying to explain that to me. And at this point, again, I didn't understand the severity of the illness. I didn't understand that my dad was physically dependent on the alcohol. I actually, at one point before this, poured all of his drink down the sink, which I now know I shouldn't have done that because withdrawal is deadly. But I dropped him back home, and I said, we'll deal with this when we get back, which is what we did. And I said to my sisters, under no circumstances, contact my dad. We need to try a different approach, because I felt like I tried everything. I felt like I tried tough love. I felt like I tried being loving and understanding. I don't think I had, but I felt like I did at the time. And I felt this time we need to stop enabling the addiction. So we need to leverage what we had against my dad. And we knew my dad's weakness was his girls. We knew that my dad's love for me and my sisters and his granddaughters was enough. We felt like it would have been enough for maybe to scare him into submission. So I saw him when we got back from the holiday, and I said, right, we're not going to see you until you admit that you have a problem and that you need help. So my youngest sister's not going to live with you anymore. She's moving out. She's coming to stay with us when she's not at university. And you're not going to see any of us, and you're not going to see the kids until you sort yourself out, Dad. It took 3 months, and I got a phone call 3 months later, and he was crying. And he said, this gets me really emotional. He said, everything that I've been through is insignificant compared to losing my children. I will do anything you want. You name it. You can be in control. I'll do it. And I was so proud of him, because at that point, he went to a charity detox centre, and he had a medical detox. And the doctor there said to me that your dad's physically dependent on alcohol. If he stops drinking suddenly without any medical support, it will kill him. And again, that didn't compute. It didn't register, because you think it's not going to happen to us. You think we'll be fine. He'll go on this. That won't happen to us. Very naively. And he did. He came off of it, and he did so well. And I got my dad back. I got that dad back that I had when I was a little girl. And I managed to have 12 months of an absolutely... and I'm so grateful we got that. And he said within that 12 months, he said to me, you saved my life. I don't think I'd still be here now if it weren't for you forcing me into that. But what we did, and what we failed to realise, again, what we didn't understand, was that he had an illness. The alcohol addiction wasn't the issue. The mental health was the issue. Alcohol addiction was a side effect of the trauma and the anxiety and the depression. We didn't treat that. We very naively assumed he's not drinking anymore, he's fine, and he's not an alcoholic anymore, he's fine, he's normal again. And we brushed it under the carpet again, and we didn't talk about it. And then we lost my granddad, in the March 2017. And that was enough. That was a pivotal moment in my dad's life for him to relapse. And again, I knew he'd relapsed because, and this is how in tune I was with my dad, I could tell whether he'd been drinking from just one sentence over the phone. I could tell. I knew. All he'd have to say to me was, hello, what are you doing, or where are you? And I would know instantly, you've been drinking. And I knew before my granddad's funeral, we had a massive argument. I said, you've been drinking again. And he was telling me he hadn't. I thought, you have. I can hear it. I can hear it in your voice. That's your drunk voice. That's what we called it, your drunk voice. That's your drunk voice. And it was like, my husband could never tell. He thought I was mad. It's like, how can you tell he's been drinking? I don't understand. You just literally picked up the phone to him. I'm like, you don't understand. I've lived with this for years. He's been drinking. I can hear it. And he'd relapsed. And it wasn't until the summer 2017. And I've never, and I can honestly say this, I've never in my entire life felt frustration like it. I was completely out of control. His addiction and illness had peaked so badly that I knew we were on a downward trajectory. I knew we were on a downward spiral. And I knew that there was only one way out for my dad at that point. Subconsciously, I knew that it was death. And I said that to him. And I was, at this point, I'm just crying and I'm angry and I'm saying some horrendous stuff to him. I'm calling him some awful stuff, swearing at him, telling him I hate him. And that was literally 2 weeks before he died. And I said to him at one point, I hated myself. And it took a lot of therapy for me to get over it. But I said, Dad, you'd be better off dead, because right now, I don't think you realise what you're doing to us. I hated myself for saying that to him. Absolutely hated myself. And he rang me crying one day and he said, did you mean all of that? And I just said, no, I absolutely didn't. I said, but I don't think you realise what you're doing to yourself. You're killing yourself and there's nothing I can do. I'm ringing people for help. I'm ringing his GP. I'm ringing helplines. And all I'm getting...
desperation.
Yeah.
It's desperation and fear, isn't it? You don't want to lose him, and, you know, those emotions are going to come out. It's just, it's very sad, but it's just your reaction is what can I do? You're absolutely desperate at that point, I guess.
And that's exactly what I was. And I remember ringing my mum and I was hysterical and I said, we need your help. I don't know what to do. This is the worst he has ever been. I really don't know what to do anymore. And literally, I think it's 4 days before we lost him, I had a phone call from him. He was hallucinating. He was seeing his dad and he was coughing up blood again and he was in a lot of pain. And he said to me, oh, if I survive this, then I'll live till old age for definite. And I thought, what do you mean by that? What is going on? What is happening? So I went round there and I went to see him and he was curled up in bed, shaking. He was bloated. He was jaundiced. He was vomiting all the time, bringing up blood. All the symptoms of alcohol dependency and withdrawal had kicked in, because at this point, where he'd been on a clinical detox, when he went back to drinking, he needed something a lot stronger than what he was drinking before for it to have an effect. And so this time he wasn't drinking lagers or beers or anything weak. He was drinking a litre of vodka a day that we know of, and he was drinking it neat.
Wow.
And he suddenly stopped. He got scared and he suddenly stopped, thinking, oh, I've gone too far. I need to stop before I get dependent on it again. But it was too late. He was already dependent on it. And we had an argument that day because I said, right, I'm calling an ambulance. You've got liver failure. We need to go to the hospital. And at that point, he kind of took control back and said, and he shouted at me and he reminded me who the parent was. And he said, you will respect my decision. I am not going in the ambulance. If you ring an ambulance, I'm not getting in it. And his exact words to me were, there are people at that hospital that deserve the doctor's time more than me. I have done this to myself. I will get off of it myself. There's children at that hospital that need to see a doctor. I'm not taking up those doctors' time because of my weakness. And at that point, I said, well, I can't watch you do this to yourself. And I went. And it took a lot. I only recently just forgiven myself for that, because I felt like I'd contributed to his death. I felt like I'd killed him.
Ooh, that's a lot.
We went. So a few days later, I got a phone call from my sister and she said, you need to get up to A&E, Dad's in a bad way. And I got there. And by this point, I think they call it wet brain. So his liver was failing and all the toxins from his liver were accumulating in the rest of his organs and going to his brain. And he wasn't drunk. So when I saw him, he wasn't drunk. It was a different kind of confusion. He didn't recognise me for starters. And he looked vacant. And he reminded me of a dementia patient. And but at that point, when from being in A&E, within 30 hours, he was dipping he was going from severity to severity within wards. So he started off in the assessment unit, and then he went into majors, and then he went from majors into resus. And then resus, we've got 2 consultant surgeons in the room showing me scans of his lungs, and it still weren't registering just how poorly he was. I mean, I've been to A&E a lot of times having kids and for myself, and I don't think I've ever been in a room with two consultants. And I think when that happens, you know it's serious. But it didn't
Yeah.
register. It still wasn't registering. And then he went from resus into a ward. And within a few hours of being on a ward, he was in intensive care, hooked up to a dialysis machine, semi-conscious. And I still wasn't accepting it. I was still in denial. And when I went to see him in intensive care, the curtains were around him. And my mum was with me and her phone rang and it was the hospital. And we both looked at each other and we knew what was coming. And out came this tired, defeated surgeon. And he just sat down and he started listing off everything that was wrong with him. And I had to stop him midway and I just said, is my dad going to survive this? And he looked at me and he said, he has a 10% chance of surviving. That's if he doesn't die when I put him on a life support machine. So I walked out the hospital. I begged my dad to try and fight it, but I felt like I was being selfish at that point because I felt like he'd gone through so much. And I felt that even if he did miraculously survive that, the lust and damage that would have had on him mentally probably would have been life-changing. And they said that as well. So I disappeared for a bit. My husband was absolutely amazing. My husband was like another son or a son to my dad. He was very close and he did all the talking with the doctors and persuaded me to come back and hold his hand while we switched him off. And it was painful. And I remember we turned off that machine and I sat there and I thought, I felt like I was at a crossroads. I was already vulnerable with my own mental health. And then now that had happened, and I knew that if I followed that trajectory that I was on with my own mental health, I would end up like my dad. Because I'm very much my dad's daughter. We're very similar in personality, and I know that I don't know the scientific evidence for this, but I know that I have an addictive personality, which is why I can't drink alcohol. I'm scared of it. I'm scared of what will happen to me if I get hooked on that, or because I know that I could very much end up like that. So I avoid it. And I knew that there's two ways that I can go, and I can go that way or I can go this way and ensure that the trauma that my dad endured stops now. It stops with this generation and it doesn't get passed on to my kids, because I do not want my kids going through what I've been through. And fortunately, that's the road I took. And I always say to people now, and it sounds really cliche, but I say that my dad saved me. My dad's death saved me. And I think if he knew that's what it would have taken for me to get my own mental health sorted and to have the therapy that I needed and to work on what I'd gone through, and so it doesn't affect my children, I think he'd have died 10 times over.
Oh, Sarah, that's so sad. I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. Sorry, I'm getting a bit emotional, but like, it's incredible. Like you're saying, basically what he did. Sorry, he sort of almost sacrificed his life for you to understand the situation, so that you didn't have to go through the same. And God, what a hero your dad was.
That's how I like looking at it that way. And I think I like to, this is why I do the work I do now, because I feel guilty. Of course I feel guilty. But I also feel a massive gratitude, and I feel a massive responsibility to help him now. I know he's not alive, but there's other things that I can do to help him. I don't want my dad being another statistic. My dad was ashamed to get support. The stigma consumed all of us. He was ashamed, and he said that. I mentioned earlier on, he said that he didn't want to go to the hospital because he'd done it himself. My dad's embarrassment and shame for what he was going through and experiencing prevented him from accessing support.
Yeah, that made Lucy and I. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, sorry, that made me really angry, and it really kind of motivated me to break down those stigmas and to really challenge them. And so I've made that my mission now, and because I think it's no different, is it, to a smoking addiction? It's no different
No.
to eating the wrong foods. And there's been so many incidences where after he died, people would say he did it to himself and he only had himself to blame. It was self-inflicted. But 80%, and I don't quote me on this, but I read a statistic and I'm pretty sure it was really high. It was really high. So it's between 80 and 85% of illnesses are environmental, which means that it's what we've done to ourselves, it's what we've eaten, it's what we've inhaled, it's what our lack of exercise. So I started thinking, well, that means, so coronary heart disease, for instance, which 90% of those, it's listed in the NHS that 90% of coronary heart disease is caused by what we eat and drink. That's self-inflicted. Surely we can't apply that logic to drinking and penalise people, bearing in mind it's so socially accepted. Like, if I tell people I'm not drinking, then they assume I'm pregnant, boring, on antibiotics, or I'm the designated driver. So it's so socially accepted, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the normalization of alcohol in our society is the problem. And I guess like what we're doing with this podcast and what you're doing is we're talking about our shame. You know, we did feel shame too. I felt shame to reach out for help because I didn't feel like my problem was bad enough to deserve professional support, a bit like your dad in a less extreme version, I guess. But it's the same situation repeated over and over again. People end up struggling in silence because they feel such shame, and there's so much stigma around this word alcoholic that we end up suffering in silence, and it's a terrible thing. Sarah, I just want to say, like, your story is so important, and I'm just so encouraged by you, and our listeners are just going to absolutely, you know, really get on board with you, I think. Your website, warriorkind.co.uk, it's a community dedicated to normalising conversations around mental health and well-being. Have you got any other projects coming up to do with that and the legacy of your dad?
Yes, so Sober Dave and I are going to be working on a few exciting collaborations coming up in the new year, based around stigma attached to alcohol use disorder. Warrior Kind, we've just launched our own peer support network app. So it's a little bit like social media, but it's completely dedicated to conversations around mental health. We've got a group within that app, especially for loved ones of alcoholics, which has actually initiated some really life-changing conversations for people. It's given people an opportunity to talk amongst other people that are going through similar things to them, but it also encourages them to get professional help. So we like to think of the app as the first step to getting support. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Gosh, that all sounds amazing. Will you send me all those links so I can add them into the show notes afterwards? So all of our listeners, I mean, I think talking about our struggles and experiences are truly what leads us to seek support and gain understanding and eventually heal. We appreciate your bravery and openness when talking about your lovely dad, Sarah. It's so wonderful to hear that, you know, even though that situation was tragic, that you are kind of triumphing from it. Thank you so much for coming on the Sober Awkward podcast. You can go to Sarah's website to find out more about her, which is warriorkind.co.uk, or you can follow her at Sarah_Drage on Instagram. Our topic today, Sarah, of course, is shame and the stigma that causes us to not reach out for support. Is there one last message you'd like to give to our listeners about what it's like and why you think your dad didn't reach out?
Yeah, I think it's oh, right, okay, how am I gonna I've got so much I want to say. I'm trying to sum it up into one sentence. I wish from my perspective back then that I would have learned more about the illness, would have understood it better and understood that was just a side effect. It was a symptom of trauma. It was a symptom of anxiety, depression. He was using alcohol to suppress those feelings. And the shame and the stigma attached to having a drink problem ultimately shamed him into silence. It shamed us all into silence. It prevented us all from accessing support and admitting that we needed the help. So I suppose I would say, if you don't understand it, then try and learn about it.
Yeah.
I do that now. That's one thing that if I don't understand something that somebody's going through because I can't relate and I don't have the same frame of reference that they do, then I'll always try and go out of my way to learn about it so that I can provide a level of support or a level of understanding. Or if I don't understand, I can say, I'm really sorry for what you're going through. I don't understand it, but I'm going to try and learn.
Yeah.
So I think just educating ourselves can be the real first step to breaking down stigmas and breaking down barriers.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, just talking about it, learning about it and educating yourself is going to lead to more of an understanding and more of an empathy for people with addiction issues, I think. Thank you,
Absolutely.
Sarah. That is
Thank
such an
you.
incredible message, and we wish you so much luck with everything you're doing. And if Lucy and I, we can ever support you in any way, you just give us a shout.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm just going to read a quote just to end the podcast, a quote from Brené Brown. We desperately don't want to experience shame, and we're not willing to talk about it. Yet the only way to resolve shame is to talk about it. Maybe we're afraid of topics like love and shame. Most of us like safety, certainty, and clarity. Shame and love are grounded in vulnerability and tenderness. So I thought that was a lovely one to end on. It just shows you like we don't like feeling vulnerable, so therefore we don't approach it, and it can be a really, really hard topic. But if you face those hard topics, it is kind of the cure to any sort of mental health and addiction issues, is to really confront those problems if you have the support behind you to do so. The book of the week this week is The Power of Vulnerability by Brené Brown. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, I just highly recommend it, and I'll put all the notes into the show notes for everybody listening. I just want to once again thank Sarah for coming on. And we're always giggly and we laugh a lot on this podcast, and we do talk a lot about statistics, but Sarah is an example of somebody who is a number out there, but it's actually her dad, it's family members, it's mums and dads and brothers and sisters and family and neighbours that we're all talking about here. They're not just numbers, and we hope that by tapping into Sarah's life and understanding the trauma and that she's been through because of shame and stigma, then hopefully more people will reach out for support. And I really appreciate you telling us our story today. Thanks everybody for listening, and we look forward to seeing you on series 3 of Sober Awkward next month. Thank you for listening to the Sober Awkward podcast.
If alcohol is affecting your life in a negative way, if you're struggling to moderate or your hangovers are causing anxiety, it might be time to reach out for help. Contact your local doctor, a therapist, or connect with your local AA or sobriety group. Vic's got one.
Yes, go onto Facebook and just search Drunk Mummy, Sober Mummy, the group. Lucy and I both agree that even though this journey can be awkward, it's definitely worth it. And if we can do it, you can too.
For more support on sobriety, head to Vic's website, drunkmummysobermummy.com.
And Lucy runs an online space to support and inspire single mums. Find out more at beanstalkmums.com.au. Finally, if you've enjoyed the Sober Awkward podcast, don't forget to follow, subscribe, review, and share it with your mates.
Don't make it sound like they have to, though.
No, they do have to. I'm not doing all this for nothing, Lucy. No.